Welcome to the second of the Religion Media Centre's general election briefings. It's my great pleasure to chair these briefings. It is my great challenge, especially today, to moderate with so many guests who have kindly agreed to be on. So please bear with me as I seek to get a hearing for all of you, and please keep comments concise. Do talk on the chat box. Alert me through the chat box if you want to come into the conversation or put up a hand. And bear with me if I sort of interrupt you. I don't mean to be rude, but I need to move along. So let's start by remembering that in our first briefing a couple of weeks ago, we shared some research from the Theos Think Tank about how religion affects turnout and party preference. They've gone on to publish more research, which looks at whether religious groups feel that they can make a difference in this election, and at the ideological profile, for want of a better word, of faith groups, whether they're left or right-leaning, and the extent to which they can be said to have particular positions on particular topics. And I'm going to start here, really, in the light of the decision by Nigel Farage yesterday to lead the Reform UK party and to stand himself, which I think brings the issue of migration even more to the fore of the campaign than it already was. So Paul Bickley, public engagement lead at Theos, I'm going to ask you an impossible question perhaps, but I'd like to know where faith groups position themselves on the sort of right-left spectrum and how you assess that in your research, and how might the findings that you've arrived at speak into this sort of political debate, particularly between Reform and the Conservatives, that we find ourselves in this lunchtime.
Thanks, Rosie. Basically, we find we've done this analysis, which takes a variety of measures from the British election study and kind of puts them together and gives us a map of where different religious groups find themselves on a ideological spectrum, which goes left to right in terms of political thinking, but also authoritarian and libertarian. So if people are familiar with the Political Compass, that's a kind of online tool, it's a bit similar to that. And what we see in that is that the Anglicans, the Anglican religious group, is the most authoritarian and right-leaning. So if there is a kind of reform-leaning group, it's Anglicans, and particularly non-practising Anglicans. So as it were, cultural conservatives, cultural Christians, they would be kind of an ideal reform voter. The other religious groups appear elsewhere on the spectrum. And the other interesting one to note is the Muslim group. That sits in quite an unusual position. They're on the political left, but they're also tending to be slightly more authoritarian than the population at large. So more conservative on issues like censorship or teaching children to respect authority. Those are the kind of questions that we asked. So overall, I would say, and it's also true to say that in our longitudinal data, when we're looking back at voting tension, that when the Reform Party launched, that there was a real spike in support for them. Well, it's not spiked because they didn't exist before, but there was their support was quite high, and again, very high amongst Anglicans. We also know from research that we're producing that they are the group that are overall coldest on immigration, so they're more likely to resist immigration. So taking all that together, I would say if Nigel Farage were trying to do a religious pitch, then he should pitch to basically non-practising Anglicans.
I'm going to just go quickly to the Jesuit Refugee Service and Sophie Cartwright, because you have made, obviously, migration an issue that you want Catholics to think about very carefully when they are voting. The Catholic bishops have issued a statement about the issues that they want voters to consider, and migration is in it. It's not the top issue by a long way. I just wonder whether, in the light of the events of the last 24 hours, whether you would be encouraging them to shout about it even more.
Well, JRS UK, yes, are calling for a politics of humanity and welcome at the general election. And one of the things that we would really point Catholics towards in thinking about this is the Catholic Bishops' Conference document, Love of the Stranger, which really sets out the importance of this issue for the Catholic bishops. And for example, they very closely echo what one of our key asks in opposing immigration detention as something that violates human dignity. So yes, I would really want to point Catholics to that document in thinking about issues for the general election.
Thank you. I wonder if I could go to Jagdev Virdi, because he's the editor of British Sikh Report. Very often we don't get statistics on Sikh voting patterns because it's a smaller demographic than Muslims and other voters. But I wonder what your report at the beginning of the year showed about Sikh voting intentions and whether you can say about whether migration features in that, whether that's an issue for Sikhs, and how their voting preferences might differ from other groups from South Asia.
Thank you. Yes, so in the British Sikh Report, the latest one, we did ask people about their voting intentions, particularly since the election was anticipated. And it showed largely about 43% support for Labour and 20% support for Conservatives. But what's interesting is actually quite a change over by age groups, with the Labour share ranging from 45% for the younger groups, 20 to 34-year-olds, 45% down to 27% for the oldest age groups.
Do you have any idea about why that shift might be taking place, or what accounts for that difference?
I think over time that when migrants have been long settled here, we know of cases where there have been shifts in family situation when they become established businesses and so on, and some who were strong Labour supporters, but over time, maybe their second generation, third, have turned more to Conservative. And that seems to be the pattern in both directions, I think.
Thank you. Mick Percy, can I come to you? You're from the Muslim Council of Britain. What do you make of the research from Theos about, Muslims being generally more of a left-leaning group than the other communities? And that's what you would expect, I guess.
Yeah, I think that we do see that when it comes to most of the topics which will determine left or right leaning decisions. I think that when it comes to certain social conservative values, it's a bit more complicated. And I think that the Labour Party positioning itself quite similar to many parts of the country, which are a bit more nervous about certain social conservative values, and I think sometimes some of those align quite a lot with some of the perspectives of mainstream Muslim communities. I would say, however, the salience of some topics and how important they rank in determining votes is interesting in this election compared to others, given foreign policy issues right now. And we've seen a lot of polling showing that, there's a 30-40% drop, 20-30, depending on which numbers you look at, between 20 to 40% drop in Labour, some community support for the left as a whole. The Labour Party specifically, but not necessarily for the left as a whole. And I think that's interesting to see as well. I'm
going to bring in Abu Bakr Nanabawa from the Muslim Vote, because on that issue of falling Muslim support for Labour, the question being, where do those votes go? I'm assuming they don't go to the Reform company, as I've been told I should call them, or the Reform Party. But where do they go? Or indeed, is there a danger that the Muslim vote doesn't come out?
The recent local elections that took place in May show that Muslims still will turn out in election and still participate. They will move from Labour to Independents or Greens in the whole, and in some circumstances Workers' Party. But what really is happening on the whole is that Muslims are still engaged with the process. They're still active. They want to find an alternative, and when alternative is available, they will actively come out and vote. If we look at the success of Galloway's campaign, where it was largely a huge part of his campaign was ensuring that the Muslim vote turned out. If you looked at recent local council results in Oldham, Dewsbury and Batley, Blackburn, where an independent group is now the official opposition to the Labour Party, it's clear that they will still turn out. They will just try and find alternative places to take their votes away from the Labour Party.
Thank you. I'd just like to come to Daniel Sugarman from the Board of Deputies. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been a big issue within the Labour Party. We'll have a lot of Jewish people considering the way they vote. Do you think that trust in the Labour Party has been won back among Jewish voters?
Thank you, Rosie. I think that it's clearly a big difference as to how the Jewish community as a whole is looking at the Labour Party in this election as opposed to the 2017 and 2019 elections. I think that there will clearly be some people who feel much more comfortable voting for the Labour Party now, given various steps that the Labour Party's taken over the last few years. I think that there may be some people who are still extremely suspicious of Labour. I think that both those viewpoints exist within the community. I do think that as a whole, the Jewish community feels that they have much more of a choice this time round. I think that many Jewish people did not feel that they had much of a choice in 2017 and 2019.
Where do you think those Jewish voters who feel that who traditionally voted Labour, those who used to vote Labour, where do you think they could feel they could go if they weren't to vote Labour? I mean, where's the obvious alternative for them if there is one?
I don't think that there is an obvious alternative for many Jews who would have previously voted Labour and are looking for a party that they see as particularly left-wing or aligned with their values in that regard. I do think that a fair number of Jewish people who voted Labour in the past but found themselves unable to do so in 2017 and 2019 will probably return to Labour at this election. I think that for various reasons, some of the other parties that perhaps exist in the sort of wider left-wing space are not seen overwhelmingly as options for many within the Jewish community, but we'll see how the results turn out.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see that Dr. Subha Sinha has joined the call. You're from the School of Oriental African Studies in London, and you've been doing some work on the South Asian vote. We've talked a little bit about that already, but I wanted to ask you whether there's a Rishi factor, whether Hindus are drawn to the Conservatives because of Rishi Sunak, or maybe they're drawn to the Conservative for other reasons. Have there been any trends in their voting patterns?
Thanks very much for having me. And hello, everyone. Well, look, I mean, there is, I don't think, a Hindu vote. So, you've got to look at the Hindu vote and then further disaggregate it along the lines of second or third generation British Asians versus relatively more recent immigrants. And then also take a look at people who are working class and those who are by now very affluent. And maybe a third one, which is a place of origin. So if you're looking at the support for the Conservatives among that particular demographic, I think richer Hindus who now have issues concerning taxes far more on their mind than issues concerning racism or immigration, they are likely to, I think, continue on with the Conservative Party and consolidate that trend that effectively happened from the time of Cameron onwards. I think that if you're looking at people who are firmly affiliated with the ruling party in India, or the so far ruling party in India, because the elections are just, the results are being counted, I think that they have a strong affinity with the Conservative Party. Those of the so-called Hindutva bent, I would imagine, have a strong affinity with that. But as for the rest of the Indian and Hindu population, I think issues that matter to them are pretty much similar to that which matter to most other voters. And these have to do with whether or not house prices are going up and down, how is the cost of living, crisis affecting them, what about the state of the NHS or of other social services and schools and the like. So, they will have some degree of difference from your non-British Hindu voter along the lines which I suggested. But then they will also be affected by almost all of the issues which are going to be at play during the elections.
And can you make any assumptions about what their views on migration, which is going to dominate this campaign, what their issues on migration are likely to be?
Well, I mean, you talked about Rishi Sunak, but one of the things that he was very keen to do was to show that he was very harsh on international students and that they would not be allowed to get families across. Also on how much longer a visa would be valid after people who came here for degrees and paid lots of money for that, would be valid for them to stay and to look for jobs there. Issues concerning the ease of getting family members to visit for long periods of time. Sunak, despite being of Indian origin, and I don't blame him for this, because he also has the right wing of the Conservative Party to pander to, he basically was someone who went along with putting restrictions on the movements of Indians. And in fact, that was a big issue and a bone of contention between the Indian and the British government, and a major roadblock as to why a trade deal was not signed between the Sunak government and the Modi government. So immigration is an issue, and I think unless, I'm not sure that Labour has an immigration policy that they have stated that is substantially different from this, because I think Labour is going to try and figure out what the larger electorate's concerns are, and whether if the Indian Hindu concerns are opposite to that of the larger electorate, I'm pretty sure that Labour is going to go ahead with their kind of polling in that particular direction.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to go to Professor Adila Shafi, who is a Professor of Education and Youth Justice at the University of Gloucester, but also founder of the Bristol Muslim Strategic Leadership Group. I wonder, Professor Shafi, whether, as somebody suggested in the chat box, you may have Muslims feeling that they can go with the alternatives to Labour in this election because most people, Nigel Farage included, seem to think Labour have got this election in the bag already. I mean, do you think there's that sort of freedom that they may be feeling in their voting?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I can only, I guess, speak much more for my own region, which is Bristol and the surrounding areas. And one of the key things that is coming out more anecdotally but quite loud is that many Muslims in our region are feeling politically orphaned in many ways, because they as Miqdad said earlier on, traditionally they have voted for Labour, and so they are feeling very conflicted, particularly because of the situation in Gaza and the war going on over there. That is still very much dominating people's political choices at the moment, and because of that reason, many of them are feeling very disillusioned with Labour and continuing to do so, despite of sometimes wanting to support their local MP who they feel has done work in this space. So we're seeing a lot of that internal conflict going on, mixed with feelings of anger. And the reason why that is because they're using this as the war on Gaza as a proxy measure for assessing their MPs or the MPs that they might vote in, their views and their moral compass as they see it in terms of social justice and humanitarian issues, which is really at the forefront of how Muslims in our region are thinking, and that is causing some angst. Because, as was said earlier on, they do want to vote and are likely to come out to vote. It is something that it's certainly in our region, people do like to, Muslim communities do like to come out and vote, but it is where do I go? And the tendency is to be looking at the independent candidates or other parties that they may not necessarily have looked to. And the other concern that many voters are having is, am I going to inadvertently vote for a candidate who I also don't believe in, or doesn't represent another really important issue that I hold dear? So in many ways, in our region, there's lots of sort of dilemmas that people are thinking about. So as well as the usual things that people vote on, education, housing, employment, economy, and so on, there is this additional measure which is superseding some of those things. And people are looking for an alternative to vote for, but are worrying that is the alternative for them, and so on. So, and whether they are voting in terms of conveying a message to Labour, or whether actually they are going to come right away from them and question their sometimes unquestioning support for any particular party.
Yeah.
So we've got a mixture of things going on here in our region.
Thank you for that. I wonder if we can go back to Theos for a moment and talk about another piece of research that they've published, which is really about levels of trust among different religious groups and the extent to which they trust politicians generally. But I'm going to, rather than tell you what the research was, I'm going to invite George Lapshynov, who's a political researcher at Theos, to tell us what you were looking at and what you were finding there. And just before I go to George, can I ask people, do put more comments and questions in the chat box. We'll probably have time to come to them shortly. Okay, thank you. George, tell me.
Yes, thank you, Rosie. In this piece of research, we were looking at something that is one step removed from the election, really, which is not about immediate party preference, but about whether people feel that they can make a difference, that their voice matters in politics and in society in general, that they feel empowered to change things in society, in politics. And our research found that religious affiliation, particularly Christians, but even more so frequent religious practice, are positively associated with higher political efficacy, so feeling that you can have an effect on politics, but also higher political trust and higher social trust, and that Christians, and particularly frequently practicing Christians, are the most civic-minded group in the UK.
Does being civic-minded mean you're trusting?
Well,
it might be exactly the opposite, mightn't it?
It's a component of it, because civic-mindedness relies on being able to trust your neighbour, being able to trust that politics, that the system works, being able to trust that there is no point in being civic-minded and engaged in society if you don't feel like any of it matters, really. So it's a whole. It's the social trust and political trust, trusting in politics, trusting in your neighbour, in fellow citizens, are foundation for the rest of politics.
Okay, I just wonder whether you can be very civically engaged, but actually not trust any of them, and that's why you're engaged. Just tell what my understanding is, that that you found that there were lower levels of trust in the political process and politics generally among Muslims. Is that the case?
Yeah, so in particularly we found social trust was quite low. So trust of the British population in general. There might be obviously a strong ethnic component there, especially if it's first generation immigrants, that they're not familiar with the rest of society to feel trusting in them. However, quite surprisingly, we found that Muslims had high political trust, that they trusted that relatively. Actually, what we found is that most people distrusted politics and distrusted each other as well. But in relative terms, within this general distrust, Muslims are actually slightly more trusting of politics than were the non-religious, for example.
I don't know if anyone would like to come in with a voice of surprise that there is not a lot of trust in politics at the moment. But Nick Dadversi, I wonder what you make of those findings around trust. I mean, I suppose the question is how do political parties build that, particularly among Muslim voters?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see those statistics and those findings, they're not massively surprising, as you'd expect. When it comes to trying to build that trust, one of the biggest challenges is that both of the main political parties haven't really been engaging with mainstream Muslim communities and mainstream Muslim groups for a while. They've been choosing individuals who they've then cast aside when they haven't linked to what they have liked to. And we've seen that with Qari Asim as one example, but there have been many of that ilk. And so with both the Conservative Party-led government right now and the Labour Party coming up in the future, the lack of engagement with mainstream Muslim organizations and groups for a long time is not a good state of affairs. And it means often sometimes many of the policies that are being developed are ones that are done in isolation of communities that are being impacted through those policies. And what you want to do is change that around. And I think the only other thing I'd note is policy really matters when it comes to, like we've talked, and a couple of people have talked about this in terms of cost of living, NHS, economy. And if you think about Muslim communities, those still end up being three of the top issues that Muslim communities care about. But often there are direct Muslim-related implications of these areas that aren't really looked at. So, for example, almost half of Muslim communities live in the 10% most or 10 to 20% most deprived areas. And if you look at that and you say, well, issues to do with deprivation need to be looked at, and the Muslim lens is important in that. So I think that, and there is research that's helping drive some of these, but those aren't really being reflected in policy, which obviously is not Muslim-specific policy, but policy that disproportionately impacts Muslim communities. So I think that that's something that we're going to hopefully see more of in the future. But the lack of engagement with mainstream Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals, I think, is a huge problem. And you see that through looking at any Twitter feed of any of the cabinet ministers out there right now, and in the past, and shadow cabinet ministers as well.
And across parties?
I think that's particularly the case for the two main parties. And the problem that we have, obviously, is that there's always a risk and a specific issue that Muslim communities face, which is that, you always will have this person knows this person who knows that person who is a problem. And suddenly that means you're not going to engage with the first person in the first place. And that level of unfairness is specifically targeted towards Muslim communities in a way that's unreasonably applied, not in a way that's to others. I mean, the number of members of parliament of the Conservative Party who engage directly with those who are linked to the far right is quite large. The number of Conservative MPs who have retweeted Tommy Robinson and still are part of the Conservative Party and don't have any issue with it. These aren't small numbers, and that the fact that many of us have talked about the institutional Islamophobia within the Conservative Party specifically as something that hasn't been dealt with is something that's well known and well documented. So the problem is that the level at which Muslim communities have to reach to be able to be an appropriate player, to be an appropriate interlocutor, is a level that's unfairly applied to Muslim communities in the views of, I think, many Muslims out there.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got some discussion in the chat box. First of all, about reform targets, and whether non-practising Anglicans might be as good a reform or better reform target than non-religious groups. That was a question that you put to Paul Bickley at Theos, McDove. I wonder if you'd like to answer it, Paul, and give a reason for your answer.
I think that the reform pitch to the voter is built around a couple of things. One of them is around general frustration with the political process. It's no surprise that Nigel Farage has chosen to stand in the constituency he has chosen to stand in. That's traditionally one of the, it's quite a low-income area. There's quite a lot of disenfranchisement, low levels of voter engagement. So I think they're really trying to trade on that distrust in the system isn't working. So connect that to what George was saying. Generally speaking, those kind of Anglican voters tend to be slightly more integrated and established. So they are not then, in a sense, when it comes to the kind of policy platforms, when it comes to things like immigration and some of the social issues, they would be prime reform targets. But I suspect that reform will really push in to that distrust in the system. The system is broken. The system has failed. It's not delivering what we want, and that Brexit hasn't worked. Things like that, and that we've not got the country country we want. So it's more that kind of general, this thing is broken, than a policy pitch. But clearly, there is an affinity there, and that's consistently across a range of measures. We saw that in the real spike there in 2019 when reform launched, that more Anglicans would have voted for reform at that point than would have voted Tory. So there's clearly an affinity there. But I think they're not going to use that.
I'm just interested in why it is the Anglicans who go to church who are, am I right, less likely, you think, to be won over by a reform argument than the Anglicans who don't go to church? Where's religion play out in this, and where is it sort of an identity?
Yeah,
I'm Church of England because I was, baptized a million years ago, sort of thing.
So that for us is a fascinating and a very important question. So what we're saying basically is that somehow religious practice has a formative effect, and I think it's probably about mixing. It's probably about the kind of moral discourse that you kind of you will hear in a church service. People be talking about responding well to their neighbours, caring for the poor, caring for the vulnerable, and that will it doesn't immediately change everybody's minds, but it has a kind of trickle down effect. So I think the more that you're in those kind of environments, then the more you're going to be led to that kind of politics, not saying to a political party, but that's going to be your political sentiment. And you're also, you might be able to kind of more hopeful kind of conversation as well. Whereas what we're seeing with those that just have a religious affinity is that that's more a way of expressing a kind of nostalgia. And that will be the simplest way of thinking about this. And one of the ways of saying that is that I want Britain as it used to be, perhaps in the past, not as it is now. So I think that's why there's a connection there with the non-practising Anglican voter, and why basically there are two different kinds of Anglican there. There's the right-leaning non-practising Anglican. Of course, it's much grayer than this in the data, but to put it as most stark, you've got a cultural Christianity, and then you've got practice Christianity, which go in slightly different directions when it comes to politics.
Catherine Peppenstone, I just wonder if we can talk a little bit about Catholics and their voting. I mean, no, the Catholic bishops aren't saying you must vote for this party or that, but they have, as well as raising the issue of migration, spoken about a number of other issues that they want voters to take into account when they are voting. I mean, where do you think this all sort of tends to lead for Catholic voters, if you might, or what are the things that you think the bishops really want Catholic voters to think about?
Well, Rosie, they want Catholics to think about a lot of different issues. I think they've made it plain that they think that the key issue is to consider that the family is the sort of absolute foundation of society, and that politicians need to effectively look after families. And so that should be something people should take into consideration. But there's a whole range of other issues that they think are very important, not least the environment. There's a link to the issues about the family. There's a grave concern about poverty. But there's two issues that I thought are particularly interesting with what the Catholic bishops have put out so far about this election, and I'd be interested to see if other faiths are doing similar things, which is that they are saying to people, the key thing right now is you've got to make sure you're registered to vote, and you must enact your democratic duty and vote. They're not saying who to vote for, but they think voting is very important and really want to see that people do get registered. So I'd be interested to know if other different faith leaders are communicating that message. And then the other thing that I was intrigued by with the Catholic, what the Catholic bishops were saying, is that they were urging people to really look seriously at individual parliamentary candidates, and there's a reason for that, which is that certain issues which in our system of government have tended to be not dealt with on party lines, but are viewed as issues of conscience, are very important to Catholics. I'm thinking of things like abortion, which is, it's a long-standing issue for them. But more recently, the whole issue of assisted dying has come to the fore. And these tend to be conscience votes. So the bishop's saying, have a look at your candidates. But what that in fact does is that bishops are saying, in a way that gets often forgotten in this country, that MPs are not delegates, they're individuals. And again, I wonder how much that is being highlighted by other religious groups, that the people standing for Parliament, yes, they're standing on a party ticket, but they are not a delegate of that party.
I don't know whether Mikdad or Abu Bakr Nanabar would like to address the issue of whether Muslim organisations are saying, the most important thing is just get out there and use your vote.
So I think when it comes to mosques in particular and Muslim charities, where there is no political angle that's permitted in any reasonable sense, then there's a big push. There's a significant push on registration across the country. We have a voter drive out there right now to get people registered. I know mosques across the country have been registering people in large numbers. It's a really, really important area. But what I would say that slightly in parallel to that, because of the salience of Gaza in particular, there are a lot of people who outside mosques and are campaigning and trying to get people to understand the specificities of the various campaigns and why a specific individual and a candidate might be the right person on a particular issue that matters to those individuals. So I think there is a bit more activism out there. There is a lot more interest in the political space. And I think that both those who recognize that and those who have a specific agenda at play are all pushing for greater registration right now, because that's something that can be done in religious and faith venues and actually can be done in a way that's good for the society as a whole, because more active community is a better community.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, really, is in regards to whether organisations are asking people to look at candidates specifically. Less so organisations, but certainly we are pushing for much more sort of political awareness, so that when you are out there voting, so in addition to the drive to get registered to vote, of which is a part of political awareness, is to get people to think about who they're voting for. And the candidates are one of those things. So like I mentioned early on, with the situation in Gaza, many Muslim voters are looking at their local candidates and assessing their stance on the issues that matter to them. And one of the key issues that matter to them is Gaza at the moment, and asking questions of themselves and the candidates in that space. So yes, there is a move towards looking at specific candidates, but I wouldn't say that as an organisation we're necessarily saying look at your candidate, but we are saying is be much more politically aware, politically literate, of which exploring your local candidate and their voting record and their stance on issues that matter to you as one of those areas is something that we are looking to push.
Yeah, just to sort of in a similar line of thinking, I think it will matter the choice of candidate in particular constituencies. So, for example, in Southall, where Virendra Sharma is retiring as a long-serving Labour MP, and I think the Labour Party is is it Deirdre, someone who's going to be the Labour Party candidate in Southall? And from what I can understand, there is a feeling that there is a cut back in representation of South Asian Hindus across the parties. And I think parties that cater to that have a better chance. So, for example, when you look at several constituencies in London, but in the Midlands and up north and things like that, you've had cultivation of a South Asian vote bank by politicians of both parties. And a lot of that is hinged on whether or not the candidate has been critical of India's human rights records, where they stand vis-a-vis Modi. So all of these things will matter, I think, in locations where the Hindu population is more influenced by the so-called Hindutva politics that Mr. Modi represents. So there are two kinds of representation issues here. One, just whether or not enough South Asian Hindus have been put up as candidates by the different parties. And secondly, whether the candidates represent a particular brand of Hindu nationalism. And that would involve, going back to, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, he was seen as being a bit too critical of India's record in Kashmir. And that, I think, put off a lot of Hindu nationalist voters and so on.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do at Muslim Vote is probably the biggest coalition of Muslim organizations, grassroots Muslim organizations, to formally endorse candidates based on a number of criteria, based on feedback from local Muslim communities. And what we found is people really have three key concerns, right? Number one, well, not in order, but one of them obviously being the Gaza issue and the response of both the two mainstream parties' response to that. But also, the national infrastructure of this country, like NHS, education, is being severely underfunded. Muslim communities are living in a lot of places in really, really poor poverty, right? And then the final thing is that, the Conservative government has spent the last 6 months in particular, but even the 5 years before that, making it harder and harder for people to protest and, mark their disagreement at government policy, whether it's their attempts to limit protesting or, shut down, increase prevent laws to shut down critique of policies within schools and workplaces, and expand the definition of extremism. And I think for the first time, what we have is a concerted effort to try and find alternatives to the Labour and Conservative Party from within the Muslim community, who have historically voted Labour, with a few exceptions. But I mean, in 2019, 86% of Muslims, according to Survation, voted for the Labour Party. So, a drop in that will be a historic event. But like I said, obviously, like everyone else has mentioned, there are the younger and older generation. And I think the younger generation have already moved away from Labour very quickly. With the older generation, that might take a bit more time, but I think that work is happening slowly.
But moved away from Labour, and they, as Dr. Shafi suggested earlier, sort of, feeling orphaned. I mean, where do you hear that they are going?
So this depends constituency by constituency. Really, there is not a monolith. I know, like, we're called a Muslim, but there is not a monolith of Muslim voters, right? Constituency by constituency, they'll have different concerns. So some areas where Muslims might be more well off, they're moving towards the Lib Dems. Other areas, they'll be moving towards Greens. And in some places, there are excellent independents running from within the local community, Muslim and non-Muslim, who the community have found it very easy to just get behind and say, this is our candidate and this is who we think will best represent our concerns in the halls of power.
Thank you. Right, we have less than 10 minutes left, so if anybody wants to make a contribution, do put your hand up. But I've just got a question, and this may be something that we need to address in future briefings. We've not really talked about the other nations. We've not talked about Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. George, is there anything that your research lends us to conclude about the importance of religion? Well, let's in those settings.
So data is unfortunately been lacking to look at Wales and Scotland in great detail. However, all the things where religion really matters in politics and in democracy in general, all the background work that is being done, the 4 years and 364 days between two elections, all of this, the social capital building, the community building aspect of religion, and the sense of empowerment it gives to people who are involved in their local community. All of this is happening. All of this is happening in Scotland and Wales as well. We also find that some of the general trends, we weren't able to go into great detail, but some of the things we observe for the Church of England Anglicans in the UK as a whole are also happening in Scotland for Church of Scotland. That you have a division between those who go to church frequently and those who go never. and with similar trends and similar preferences, political preferences.
There's a side point here about some of the polling. Agencies really need to work harder to get decent religious subsamples. Even in the BS data set, which is very copper bottomed, it's a very solid social science survey. I think I was looking the other day in the Scottish population, they had a Muslim sample in single figures. So at that point you just can't make any analysis. So there's a bit of a problem there with the data that we're working with, and we're going to be I think trying to supplement some of this stuff as we move towards the election and fill out the picture. We think we know the kind of broad outlines, but there's more to be said.
Thank you. Well, we'll end in just a moment. I just wonder whether anybody has either got any predictions, it might be a bit early for that, or whether there's anything that you feel is missing from the campaign so far, which the political parties really need to sit up and take notice of. Is there anything that they're overlooking? And I've got Dr. Sabir Sinha responding to that.
I'll just come up with one prediction, which is that in areas of the Midlands and perhaps some bits of London, you might find that the Hindu voters will go for Conservative Party candidates against the grain of the national mood than one is expecting. And it is possible that the Conservatives might even pick up a couple of seats in locations which such a population dominates.
Thank you. Any other predictions or thoughts? Otherwise, I'm going to pounce on one or two people. Tony Goodger, you have do introduce yourself.
I actually work for a trade association, which is what the logo is in behind me, which is non-religiously affiliated. But I am a person of faith. In fact, I probably describe myself as a person of faiths in the plural. And I live in a rural parish in the East Midlands. I know the Liberal Democrats have mentioned social care today. I work very part-time for this trade association. My full-time job is as an unpaid carer for my wife, who is terminally ill. It is interesting that the Conservatives and Labour are shying away from the issue of social care. It sat in the too difficult to manage tray for years and years and years. I've been an unpaid carer for only 5 years, and I'm 60, so I'm physically fit and I'm able to cope with my wife. She has motor neuron disease. But for many people, they face poverty as a result of becoming carers. They face unfair or enlarged utility bills. We particularly do, because of wheelchairs having to be plugged in overnight. My wife's voice, she doesn't sound like Stephen Hawking, by the way. You can program it to what you want now. That has to be plugged in overnight and things like that. So there is a social care dividend. There are an awful lot of unpaid carers out there, something like 5 million. Therefore, there's about 5 million votes going. And if someone would address this properly, as Ed Davey has done, because he is an unpaid carer, then I think you would see a swing towards that. I was deciding about voting. I'm by and large a floating voter, but there are two things that are important to me. One, social care, and two, nuclear disarmament. And whilst the Lib Dems are in favour of the nuclear deterrent, social care matters more to me, so they'll be getting my vote.
Thank you. I think we'll leave you with the last word, Tony. Thank you so much for that contribution. We had various people applauding on the chat. Thank you for bringing that to the fore at the end of our discussion. And I hope that political leaders are listening. Thank you very much, everybody. There will be another Zoom on the general election and religion before too long, and I hope you'll join us. Bye-bye.